What you're about to listen to is part two of a multiple-part series devoted to the American Revolution. Now, if you're someone who doesn't need to get the whole storyline from the beginning to the end, you can, by all means, continue to listen. But if you're someone who typically is going to want the full picture, and context is everything with history, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to the first episode, just one before this, to get an idea of what's been going on in this story up until now. But this is a podcast on the American Revolution for this series, and it's all about a free country, so do whatever the hell you want. This is part two of the American Revolution.
It's history like you've never heard it before. You're listening to The Monday American with your host, Andrew Garrett.
Now, let's imagine for a minute that you just got hired to do a job, and your employers were new to this in some respects, and let's imagine that you had some experience and you were the logical choice. Let's also imagine that you had all the employees that worked under you that you had to answer to in a way, like kind of a morale of the company sort of thing. How long do you think that you would stay employed if you failed at every single task you did in the first couple months? And not only did you fail, you were able to almost win, almost beat out the other competition, but then you failed. And it wasn't a total loss, like the company didn't get dissolved or anything, but you lost the deal. You lost the sale, you lost the, whatever. And let's say to top it off, at the board meeting at the end of the 2 or 3 months, you break down, you start weeping because you failed. How long do you think you'd stay employed in that scenario? And it's something I always think of because a lot of people forget that the first couple months of George Washington's career as the head of the United States Continental Regular Army was mired with failure. He failed at almost every aspect of it, and yet he was able to turn it around and ultimately reach a victory that was like the most American thing that anyone's ever done. So I always like to ask that question: is how long do you think you'd last as an employee? Because I don't know. I have no idea why they didn't fire him. I mean, if you're the Congress, Continental Congress, and you're seeing this guy fail, your own life is on the line. So why in the world are you letting him in there if he's losing? It's just an interesting thought. So last time, we ended with the battles of Lexington and Concord and how that set off the war. Now, what I want to go into great detail in on this episode is who won that war for them. And that was George Washington. George Washington is not the kind of guy that you would have picked first for the role of leader for the American Revolution. Born in Virginia to a fairly wealthy family, he was educated very well and went straight into military service, which was customary for that day. Now, if you recall, George Washington was part of the French and Indian War. I believe he was a sergeant. He was given formal military training back then by the British. What he was up against now was an entirely different set of circumstances against an entirely different enemy. And this time, rather than being back in the woods and back in the hills and forests, he was in Boston, where there was no natural terrain to deal with. There was a city rather than woods. And the enemy had been there for years, and many of the people living in the city didn't want the American side to win in the first place. So it should really go without saying that Washington is up against insurmountable odds. He has in comparison, no troops. They are nearly out of gunpowder already, and Bunker Hill has not even started yet. Now let's talk about the Battle of Bunker Hill. Bunker Hill was the first real official battle of the Revolutionary War. Essentially, the British had been occupying Boston for a number of years up to this point, and after the battles of Lexington and Concord, you'll remember that the colonial troops surrounded and started besieging the city. What Bunker Hill was a battle that resulted from a long siege of Boston. It's included in the Battle of Boston. Now, when the colonials were besieging the city, the Battle of Bunker Hill, it took place. And it took place 1 year before the Declaration of Independence was signed. It was the first real engagement of American militia as soldiers against the British regular army. It was fought on June 17th, 1775, in the early stages of the American Revolution. The battle is named after Bunker Hill in Charlestown, Massachusetts, which was peripherally involved in the battle. It was the original objective of both the colonial and the British troops, though the majority of combat ended up taking place on the adjacent Breed's Hill. On June 13th, the leaders of the colonial forces besieging Boston learned that the British were planning to send troops out from the city to fortify the unoccupied hills around the city. It would essentially give them control of Boston Harbor. In response, the colonials took 1,200 troops under the command of William Prescott, and they were able to occupy Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill. And during the night, the colonists constructed a very strong redoubt on Breed's Hill, as well as some smaller fortified lines across the Charlestown Peninsula. Now, this redoubt, this is the key to the entire battle, because it was so strong, it helped them lose a victory. And what I mean by that is that the battle was a tactical victory for the British, but it proved to be a sobering experience for them nonetheless. It involved many more casualties than the Americans had incurred, including a large number of officers. I know that the British were very much underestimating the strength of the colonials, and they did it so much so that they were willing to rush headlong into a massively fortified position. There's stories about one officer who's second in command had a bottle of wine following him around on the battlefield. To say that they took this battle seriously to begin with would be an understatement. Or I'm sorry, an overstatement. The battle, it discouraged the British Army from any further frontal attacks against the American lines for the rest of the entire war. As far as casualties, the Americans were much fewer. Their losses did include a general, his name was Joseph Warren, and a major, Andrew McClary, who was actually the final casualty of the battle. But the battle led the British to adopt a more cautious planning and maneuver execution in future engagements. It was evident in the subsequent New York and New Jersey campaign, and arguably helped rather than hindered the American forces. Their new approach to battle was actually giving the Americans greater opportunity to retreat if defeat was imminent, and the costly engagement also convinced the British of the need to hire substantial numbers of foreign mercenaries to bolster their strength. Now, back to that point of retreating, that is often a overlooked talent in war. If you can retreat when you know that you are going to lose a battle and stop the bleeding while you have a chance, it's an enormous tactical ability to be able to retreat and retreat well. And there is maybe no one better in the history of warfare at retreating tactfully and as successfully as Washington was able to do time and time again. It even seemed like the weather was in his favor. But before we get into just this part of Washington, we need to kind of understand where he came from in order to kind of piece this whole thing together. He was born in Tidewater, Virginia on February 11th of 1732. He had very little education, only 7 or 8 years of schooling by a private tutor. He knew no Latin, no Greek, no law, and So many prominent Virginian patriots had that education, and those close to him knew that he was self-conscious about this. But through steady application, he had learned to write in a clear, strong hand and to express himself on paper with force and clarity. He learned to conduct himself in the ways of an elaborate, polite society of the day with perfect manners and just was well polished. He learned, or he carried with him, I should say carried with him, he carried out some of the rules of this rule book called The Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation. He had laboriously copied this book down. Rule number 1 read, "Every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those who are present." Washington enjoyed parties, and particularly the company of attractive women. He, as would have been said by British officers, he liked his glass, his lass, his game of cards. Though gambling never became the obsession it was for so many of his counterparts on the British side. The great teacher for Washington was experience. And experience is really the best teacher of it all. At age 16, he had set out to make his way in the world, and he was a surveyor's apprentice on an expedition into the wilderness of Western Virginia. Through the Blue Ridge Mountains and all that, he learned all his survival skills, his mountaineering, all of this then. In 1753, at the age of 20, he was sent by the governor of Virginia to the wilds of western Pennsylvania to challenge French claims to the Allegheny River Valley. And if you listen to the first episode, we talked about this battle that kicked off the French and Indian War. He made his attack known, and he made his name known. On his first command, a year later, inexperience and poor judgment would lead to his famous encounter with French troops and Indians at Great Meadows in the same remote corner of western Pennsylvania. It was Washington's first defeat, and it set in motion the conflict that ultimately involved much of the world. Washington wrote about that attack, quote, "I heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there is something charming in the sound." Now, one thing I do want to point out here about Washington is he's such a rare character, and I truly don't believe the revolution would have happened the way it did without him. Obviously, it would have happened differently, but there's no possible way it would have succeeded the way it did without him. The thing he wrote about the bullets whistling, it was in the London Magazine, which could have easily been taken as just the young bravado of a youth trying to make his name, but he was one of those rare few who, under fire, were without fear, and so much of that goes back to who he was. He did things differently in a good way, and people noticed. One of the things that people always seemed to notice that always sticks out to me about George Washington is that all these accounts of who he was and the kind of man he was, what he did with the revolution in the army and all these leadership positions, he was always well known for being on horseback. And I think that's a really interesting thing that almost every record that exists has him on a horseback at some point. Thomas Jefferson considered him the greatest horseback rider who had ever lived. He was known to be able to hunt for 7 hours straight. I mean, that's a long time. And he was going extremely fast, leaping fences, and always to the end of the hunt to be on the kill. And riding and hunting was considered not only a measure of his love for the chase, but his exceptional physical stamina. But it was also a measure of his uncommon, unrelenting determination. And that is one of the things that ultimately won the war for us. And one of the things that most people don't take into effect is his incredible humility. I think that is truly, especially further on down the road in this timeline in his presidency, that man was essentially given the crown of America by the people, and he turned it down. But he also was not wanting to lead this army because of his humility. So he wrote a letter to his wife, Martha, in which he said, "Far from seeking this appointment, I have used every endeavor to avoid it, not only from my unwillingness to part with you and the family, but from a consciousness of its being a trust too great for my capacity. It has been a kind of destiny that has thrown me upon this service. Now, there are quite a few oddities, you could say, with Washington being the leader that they chose. It was a matter of record that he had been retired from military life for 15 years, during which he had not even drilled a militia, and his only prior experience had been in backwoods warfare, which was a very different kind of warfare, and most notably in the Braddock campaign of 1755, which had been an utter disaster. He was by no means an experienced commander. He had never led an army in battle, and he had never before commanded anything larger than a regiment, and never had he directed a siege. Washington was pretty much aware of his limitations. In his formal acceptance of the new command, which was on June 16, 1775, standing in front of Congress, he had addressed John Hancock, and he said, quote, "I am truly sensible of the high honor done me in this appointment, yet I feel great distress from a consciousness that my abilities and military experience may not be equal to the extensive and important trust. However, as the Congress desire it, I will enter upon the momentous duty and exert every power I possess in their service and for support of the glorious cause." And the thing is, he knew he might not succeed, and he gave Congress a fair warning. "But lest some unlucky event should happen unfavorable to my reputation, I beg it may be remembered by every gentleman in the room that I this day declare with utmost sincerity, I do not think myself equal to the command with which I am honored." And ultimately, that is what George Washington went down in the books for, was his incredible humility in being able to basically notify people that he wasn't the best choice, but he was the best choice right then. And he never was, he almost seemed free from human corruption. I mean, like I said earlier, he was basically handed the crown, and he told them, no thank you, and here's why you shouldn't do that anymore. And since then we haven't. So when I say that Washington embodies the American Revolution, I mean he really basically set the course for the country in the best possible way. Now, I think it is without question that Congress had made the right choice, and not the least of reasons was merely political. As a Virginian, Washington represented the richest and most populous of all 13 colonies. He himself had had years of political experience in the Virginia legislature and as a member of the Continental Congress. It was as one of them that the members of Congress knew him best and respected him, not as a general. But the importance of this is that he knew the ways of politics, and he knew factious politicians. He understood how the system worked, and for all the delays and frustrations, however severe the test of patience he was to suffer in his dealings with them and with the system, he never forgot that Congress held the ultimate power, that he, the commander-in-chief, was just the servant of some 56 delegates who, in far-off Philadelphia, unlike Parliament, were meeting in secrecy. And that displays his incredible ability to lead America in the revolution of the political side of things. But what is apparent to all is that Washington was in the prime of his life. He was a strapping man. He had commanding presence. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, and he weighed roughly 190 pounds. His hair was reddish brown, his eyes were gray blue, and the bridge of his prominent nose was unusually wide. His face was largely unlined, but freckled and sunbeaten and slightly scarred by smallpox, and a few, quote, defective teeth were apparent when he smiled. He carried himself like a soldier, and he sat a horse like the perfect Virginia gentleman. It was the look and bearing of a man accustomed to respect and being obeyed. He was not austere. There was no hint of arrogance. Amiable and modest were words frequently used to describe him, and there was a softness in his eyes that people remembered. Yet he had a certain distance and manner that set him off from or above others. "Be easy, but not too familiar," he would often advise his officers, "lest you subject yourself to a want of that respect which is necessary to support a proper command." It was a philosophy that was very unfamiliar to most Yankees, who saw nothing inappropriate about a captain shaving one of his soldiers, or rough-hewn General Putnam standing in line for his rations along with everyone else. And it wasn't easy for Putnam and others of the older officers to change their ways either. On one occasion, surveying the work of one of the defenses by horseback, General Putnam paused to ask a soldier to throw a large rock in the path up to the parapet. "Sir, I am a corporal," the soldier protested. And General Putnam responded with, "Oh, I ask your pardon, sir." And then he dismounted his horse, and he threw the rock himself, to the delight of everyone present. The Philadelphia physician and patriot Benjamin Rush, who was a staunch admirer of Washington, observed that, quote, "He has so much martial dignity in his deportment that you would distinguish him to be a general and a soldier from among 10,000 people. There is not a king in Europe that would not look like a valet de chambre by his side." Washington's effect on the troops and young officers was striking. Joy was visible on every countenance, which were the words of Nathaniel Greene. And he finished that by saying, "And it seemed as if the spirit of conquest breathed through the whole army." But at the same time, he was able to inspire this army with the vision of what they were fighting for. And if you had asked any man on the battlefield that day what was the purpose of what they were fighting for, what were you fighting for individually, I think that every single one of those soldiers would have pretty much repeated Washington's own words when he said that the object was, quote, "neither glory nor extent of territory, but a defense of all that is dear and valuable in life." Independence was not mentioned, nor had it been mentioned on the minds of those who had fought at Bunker Hill, or in Washington's thoughts when he took command of the army. And a lot of people forget that in the early stages of the war, the idea was to just kind of rejoin England. In the New York Provincial Congress, Washington, I believe it was Washington, even said himself, "Every exertion of my worthy colleagues and myself will be equally extended to the reestablishment of peace and harmony between the mother country and the colonies." But more and more there was talk of independence, especially as Washington drew up his battle plans for the city of Boston. Now remember that after the battles of Lexington and Concord, the American militia kind of chased the British back to Boston and surrounded and quote-unquote sieged the city. And that's pretty much where they still were. They had made zero progress. The Battle of Bunker Hill had happened, but that wasn't even in Boston proper. That was just on the outlying territories for the harbor. And Washington began to draw up battle plans for the eventual battle he knew was coming for Boston. It had been in a state of monotony for quite some time at this point. One of the soldiers, James Warren, he was the president of the Massachusetts Assembly. He wrote, "Things hereabouts remain in pretty much the same situation. We look at their lines and they view ours. They want courage to attack us and we want powder to attack them, and so there is no attack on either side." And it was pretty much a stalemate for a very long time. The defenses of both sides had been built up so much to the point that both sides' soldiers highly doubted either would attack each other because of how strong those defenses were. And that shortage of gunpowder was really the biggest plague for Washington throughout, most of the war. Remember, he was fighting even though they were massively in debt, a very, very wealthy country, and they had almost no money of their own, and they had no gunpowder. It was bad enough that he sent a very young general to Fort Ticonderoga that had been abandoned. They had taken it from the British, but there was no one there. And this general, I believe he was a colonel or something, not a general, but basically he told Washington, "Hey, we can go get those guns from Fort Ticonderoga, and I know I can do it." And Washington sent him away to go get those guns immediately. It was so bad that the morning gun, which was just a gunshot that would announce the start of the morning, it was a camp ritual, that was abolished. Washington gave strict orders that every colonel or commanding officer of a regiment needed to appoint 30 men that were active, bold, and resolute to use spears in the defense of the lines instead of guns. This was a very, very big deal. Now, aside from that, this is where Washington begins to really lead his army. And he starts it with that massive physical presence that we talked about earlier. In the winter, a snowball fight broke out on Harvard Yard between about 50 soldiers and another 50 sailors from a different regiment. And the fight quickly turned pretty ugly, with biting and gouging, and with, according to one who was there, as much apparent fury as the most deadly enmity could create. And hundreds of others were rushing to the scene. Soon more than 1,000 men had joined in this big, furious brawl, and then George Washington arrived. And the account went a little bit like this. I only saw him and his colored servant, both mounted. With the spring of a deer, he leaped from his saddle, threw the reins of his bridle into the hands of his servant, and rushed into the thickest of the melee. With an iron grip, seized two tall, brawny, athletic, savage-looking riflemen by the throat, keeping them at arm's length, alternating shaking and talking to them. Washington led this army, and that was his instance of showing his strength and ability to do so. Now, at the Cambridge headquarters in Boston, Washington declared in his general orders for that New Year's Day of that year the commencement of a new army, which in every point of view is entirely continental. And then the army, which was still 90% a New England army, it had a name. It was the Continental Army. And George stressed the hope that the importance of the great cause we are engaged in will be deeply impressed upon every man's mind. Everything dear and valuable to freemen was at stake, he said, calling on their patriotism to rally morale and commitment, but he was also expressing exactly what he felt. So they were short on powder and they were short on men. The men they had, their enlistments were nearly up, and George Washington was still able to lead the army with this type of morale-boosting speech and regain commitments to keep on fighting. And it was pretty good that he was able to do so, because the fight was about to happen, and it would be forever known as the Battle at Dorchester Heights. Now, Dorchester Heights is the name of a cluster of hills surrounding Boston that had been largely untouched by the British and pretty much ignored by the Americans up until this point. And even the loyalists who were in Boston would question the British and their inaction of taking those hills. And it came down to a couple of odd series of events. The British were considering just abandoning Boston altogether before the winter, but such was the communications at the time that by the time they were able to plead their case to abandon Boston and retreat to the bigger, what they knew would be the bigger Battle of New York, the winter had already come and it was too late. So basically they just kind of looked at it and said, all right, we're not going to do anything. We're going to hunker down for the winter. But if they move on Dorchester Heights, talking about the Americans, then we will move immediately and swiftly. And that was pretty much their position. Now, George Washington was pretty much the complete opposite of that. He was growing incredibly tired of inaction, and he was tired of encircling the city, and he also knew that that winter was coming. And the winter that year proved to be a exceptionally harsh winter, which was something that the Redcoats were completely unaccustomed to, and it was very, very harsh on them, but also because of the state of affairs of the American Army, George Washington had to put off his plans for an attack as well. And this hold on his attack is where he became incredibly downtrodden, and it's where he first begins doubting himself. And really, he wrote one of the most forlorn letters of his life. He told one of his aides that, quote, few people know the predicament we are in. He filled page after page of the same troubles and woes that he had been reporting persistently to Congress for so long, and he would still report to John Hancock that same day there was too little powder, there was still no money, and so many of the troops had given up and gone home against orders, carried off muskets that were not their own, that their supply of arms was depleted to the point where there were not enough for new recruits. George Washington said, quote, We have not at this time 100 guns in the stores of all that have been taken in the prize ship, which was a captured British vessel that they had gotten. On paper, his army numbered between 8,000 and 10,000. In reality, probably only about half that number were fit for duty. And it was because he had been unable to attack Boston that things had come to such a pass that he was convinced of. The changing of one army to another in the middle of winter, with the enemy so close at hand, was like nothing, quote, in the pages of history, that the British were so blind to what was going on and the true state of his situation he considered nearly miraculous. He was downcast, and he wrote to Reed a letter. I have often thought how much happier I should have been if instead of accepting of a command under such circumstances, I had taken my musket upon my shoulders and entered the ranks, or if I could have justified the measure to posterity, and my own conscience had retired to the back country and lived in a wigwam. If I shall be able to rise superior to these and many other difficulties which might be enumerated, I shall most religiously believe that the finger of Providence is in it, to blind the eyes of our enemies, for surely if we get well through this month, it must be for want of their knowing of the disadvantages we labor under. And so it turned out that Washington's complaints were, historically speaking, about the same complaints as every general would ever to this day complain about. Not enough money, not enough men, and not enough guns. And all that was about to change when Knox, who had gone to Fort Ticonderoga under Washington's orders, came back from Fort Ticonderoga with every single gun from the fort intact, and not a single one was lost. It was clear to all who saw them march around Boston with those guns that the stalemate at Boston was about to change dramatically. So Washington began to, speed up things in his headquarters as the coming battle was imminent, and he was a little bit despondent at the number of riders and uniformed officers that were coming in, and they were giving evidence of something in the distance happening with the British, etc. He wrote to a good friend, Joseph Reed, and said, quote, "My business increases very fast from great changes." And he was asking for Reed's help when he finished with, "It is absolutely necessary to have persons that can think for me as well as execute orders." And that is one of the parts that makes Washington so unique, is that he trusted, I wouldn't say trusted, he had people who were quote unquote low on the totem pole who he trusted with decisions and big decisions. And he essentially gave a test of democracy for America to come within his own army. But we'll touch more on that in a minute. So, speaking of that army, the strength of the army was still pretty much deficient. The situation was so serious that Washington confided that he was, quote, obliged to use art to conceal it, even from his own officers. The bitter cold continued of that winter, and on January 27th, the thermometer dropped to 4 degrees. The low on January 28th was 1 degree, 2 degrees on January 30th. As cold as it was, there was still no ice bridge that was sufficient enough to carry an army. I remember Dorchester Heights is across the bay from Boston proper, from where the newly founded Continental Army was. Some mornings, Washington himself went to the bay to jump up and down on the ice himself to test its strength. He had made personal reconnaissance to the approaches to Dorchester, even the heights apparently, accompanied by several of his officers. According to one account, Washington and the others had left their horses and were proceeding on foot when suddenly 2 mounted British officers came at a gallop and sent them, quote, running and scampering for life. A week later after that meeting, a British raiding party crossed the ice to Dorchester and burned several farmhouses. So to say that this would be a surprise to wake up one morning and see the Americans or the British trying to get over to Dorchester Heights, it would be a complete lie. Both sides knew what the other was going to do pretty much. They just didn't know how and when. Well, on February 16th, Washington convened his council of war for what he hoped would be a unanimous agreement that the time had come to attack. Quote, a stroke well aimed at this critical juncture might put a final end to the war, he argued. And perhaps a better question was never agitated in a council of war, wrote General Gates of the meeting, and whatever art that Washington may have exercised to conceal the truth of the Army's strength from his officers, there was no doubt in Gates and others in that room mind the state that they were in. The Council of War marked the fourth time that Washington had called for approval for an attack on Boston, and once again, wisely, the generals said no. Very likely, the shattering defeat at Quebec earlier had reinforced the view that any assault on so heavily a defended position was just not worth that risk. There was, however, an agreement to a different plan. Instead of striking at the enemy where they would be well fortified, they would lure the enemy out to strike at them, as had been done at Bunker Hill. From the accounts of spies and British deserters, it was by now known that Howe, General Howe, the leader of the British, had sworn he would, quote, sally forth if ever the Americans tried to occupy Dorchester. And so it was resolved that preparations began, quote, with a view of drawing out the enemy. Washington was very upset over this decision not to attack. However, he later came around and said, perhaps the irksomeness of my situation led me to undertake more than I could be warranted by prudence. But all that was done with. The issue, quote, now at an end, and I am preparing to take post on Dorchester. And this would be the opening battle of the Battle for Boston. Now, the most interesting thing about this quote-unquote battle is that it was hardly actually a battle. It ended up with the eventual surrender, or not surrender. The British, they evacuated Boston. They just left it. They deserted it. But nevertheless, there was a small battle fought. But really, the reason I'm bringing up this point is to show you kind of the genius of Washington's leadership in the Army and how he approached difficult situations. So Dorchester Heights was made up of twin hills, and the distance from these summits to the nearest British lines at Boston Neck was about 1.5 miles, which was well within range of a 12 or 18 pound cannon. The distance to where most of the British fleet laid in Long Wharf was greater. It was about 2 miles away, which was also with range, but barely. So Washington's plan was to occupy the heights on a single night before the British knew it was happening, because they didn't have the strength to face them head on. Just what they did at Bunker Hill. This time, however, there were guns from Ticonderoga to haul in place, and the heights of Dorchester were considerably steeper than that of Bunker Hill. At an elevation of 112 feet, they were actually almost twice as high. More seriously, the frozen ground on top was, quote, impenetrable as a rock, in Washington's own words, which meant that digging trenches and throwing up breastworks in the usual fashion would be impossible, at least in one night and with no noise. So that was his plan. Now he had to figure out the solution, which was a highly sophisticated scheme whereby the fortifications would be fabricated elsewhere, out of sight, and then brought all together with a lot of manpower, a lot of ox, and hauled in along with the heavy cannons to the heights of Dorchester, where all would be in place and ready for action the next morning. So they put this plan together, and they did it. That's the thing about the whole revolution, is they just kind of came up with ideas and they made them happen. To divert the enemy and drown out the noise of the work parties, Washington planned to proceed with the operation of night barrages of artillery fire from Roxbury, Cobble Hill, and Lechmere Point, all around Boston where they already were, where they had a number of guns from Ticonderoga newly in place. As critical and as dangerous as any part of his operation would be the crossing of the low-lying causeway of the Dorchester Peninsula. It stood in plain view of British lines at the Boston Neck, who were less than a mile away. To conceal all movement over the causeway, an extended barrier of hay bales would be thrown up. And in order to bring the army to maximum strength, 2,000 Massachusetts militia were called up to serve, while work details were dispatched to round up wagons, carts, a total of 800 oxen. At the Army's hospital in Cambridge, thousands of bandages were being prepared and additional beds made ready. There were notices in the Boston Gazette that called for volunteer nurses. And, everyone kind of knew it was ramping up. Abigail Adams wrote, quote, "The preparations increase, and something is daily expected. Something terrible it will be," she wrote to her dearest friend, which is what she and John Adams would use as pen names for each other, because he had recently been sent back to Pennsylvania. Now, when all these preparations had finally been put together in place and decided on, the move on Dorchester would begin after dark on March 4th, and it was going to be completed by first light the morning of the 5th, which just so happened to be the
anniversary of the Boston Massacre. Now, one of the interesting things about this entire situation is that one of the closest observers within Boston, who was a loyalist, his name was Peter Oliver, for the British, they could tell what was going on. They could tell they were about to move. The General Howe of the British, he kind of just shot it down. The warnings were not taken seriously, and he was flat out written a note that said the rebels, quote, are intending to bombard the town from Dorchester. They were just shot down. On Saturday evening, March 2nd, Washington wrote in haste that everything must be set and ready to go as planned on Monday night, March 4th. The bombardment of Boston began midnight Saturday and continued at intervals until morning. The British answered with a heavier and louder response of cannon. Now, one of the things I wanted to bring up was that most of the modern day movies, like take for instance The Patriot, they make cannons seem much less impressive or much less strong as they actually were. Remember, these things could shoot 2 miles, and the depictments of them in the movies, they don't really do them justice. For instance, Abigail Adams was at her house 10 miles away, and she wrote, quote, "The house shakes with the roar of cannon. No sleep for me tonight." British Captain Charles Stewart described the exchange as the sky filling up with sheets of fire. I mean, these were not small weapons, and these made a lot of noise. They did a lot of damage, and I think that due to the overall power and just awesome display of artillery that we saw in World War I and II, the earlier type of artillery gets overshadowed greatly. But never forget that this was a very serious bombardment. And a very serious bombardment is exactly what Washington was hoping for. At the first crash of the first gun, General Thomas and 2,000 men started across the causeway. They moved quickly, they moved silently, and they were shielded from view by long barriers of hay bales. They had an advance guard go ahead of them that was made up of 800 men that they were mostly riflemen who went first to fan out along the shores in case the British made any attempt to kind of figure out what they were doing at night. The main work party of 1,200 men followed immediately after them, included heavy wagons, hundreds of carts that were loaded with chandeliers, fascines, hay bales, barrels, and the most important of all, the guns from Ticonderoga. Dr. Thatcher, who was crossing the causeway with troops, noted, "The whole procession moved on in solemn silence and with perfect order and regularity, while the continued roar of cannon serves to engage the attention and divert the enemy." He also noted with gratitude, quote, "the vast number of large bundles of screwed hay arranged in a line next to the enemy, to which we should have been greatly exposed while passing." Progress was extremely difficult, but with the team of oxen, wagons, and all the work party, they were able to get it done. Now, what happened next was one of the things Washington was pretty much famous for. It was completely out of his control, but it just always seemed to work out for him. The weather. The weather is a humongous part of his military leadership story. The night of this work was unseasonably mild. It was perfectly beautiful with a full moon. It was perfectly ideal for working, as if the hands of God were directing things, which all those men felt they were. Reverend William Gordon, like many others, felt for sure it was God. And he wrote about the weather. "It was hazy below, so that our people could not be seen, though it was a bright moonlit night above the hills." I mean, literally perfect for what they were going for, and you couldn't have asked for better weather. At Cambridge, on the moonlight common, Generals Greene and Sullivan paraded with 4,000 troops in front of college buildings, ready to move to the river in the shallow draft boats in the event of a signal from Roxbury Church steeple. Recounting the night's events later, General Thomas would say, "It was as early as 10 o'clock when the fortifications on the heights were sufficiently ready to defend against small arms and grape shot. It was also at that same time when British Lieutenant Colonel Sir John Campbell reported to Brigadier General Francis Smith that, quote, the rebels were at work on Dorchester Heights. I mean, straight up, they just knew where they were and knew what they were doing. It was news that would have called for immediate action, but Smith, who was slow-moving and slow-thinking, he chose to ignore it. From that point on, the work proceeded unnoticed by any British officers or troops on guard or by any of the loyalists in Boston who served as the willing eyes and ears for the British. On the heights, the men toiled with picks, shovels, and breaking frozen ground for earth and stone to fill these chandeliers and barrels that they were using to throw down at the eventually invading British. At 3 a.m, a relief force of 3,000 men moved in, and an additional five regiments of riflemen took up positions near the shore. By the first light, everything was ready, and with at least 20 cannon in place. It was utterly phenomenal that they could get this done. General Heath wrote, and he was really not even exaggerating when he said, quote, "Perhaps there was never so much work done in so short a space of time." When British commanders woke up and looked up at the heights, they could scarcely believe their eyes. The hoped-for, all-important surprise was total. General Howe exclaimed, "My God, these fellows have done more work in one night than I could make my army do in 3 months." Now, one of the benefits to this total surprise and the way this plan was carried out is that Archibald Robertson was a British engineering officer. He calculated that to have moved all that stuff up there and to put it in places they had done, it must have required at least 15 to 20,000 men. General Howe was a little bit more conservative and put Washington's number at 14,000. And in reality, it was nowhere near that close. But again, that was one of Washington's characteristics of military leadership. He was exceptionally skilled at deception in warfare, not in the negative connotation that could carry, but he was just good at counterintelligence, really. The word of this feat would be printed in London papers, and they would say, quote, "This morning at daybreak, we discovered 2 redoubts on the hills of Dorchester Point and 2 smaller works on their flanks. They were all raised during the night with an expedition equal to that of the genie belonging to Aladdin's wonderful lamp." So they literally had papers in London saying that it seemed like magic had to be done in order to do what the American soldiers were doing or did. And that was all part of Washington's plan. And now came time for the British response to this miracle, the miracle on ice, if you will, and they didn't know what to do. They eventually decided that they were going to take 2 regiments up the hill in kind of this non-committal appearance of an attack, and they would... It was very difficult to gather what their real plan was. There were several conflicting accounts that I found in all the research for this, and it seemed that basically it's easier to tell you how it happened rather than how they intended it to happen. They started off carrying these 2 regiments up these big ships, and there was a storm the night they did this, or the day they did this, that basically changed everything for the British. Now there was talk of before Dorchester Heights, they were already planning on abandoning Boston, but regardless, what happened was they sent some troops up to attack because you can't just let them take the hill. And when they went, the winds were so severe that it blew over fences, and it washed those 2 ships ashore. So then General Howe and Gage decided to issue the order to evacuate Boston and retreat to New York. So a lot of historians argue that they had planned on doing that beforehand, but remember that history is always written with a favor to the author, and these British generals were certainly they were not self-loathing at all. They would certainly write favorably of their own decisions. It seems that the storm was the excuse used to retreat honorably by the British, and that was the Battle of Dorchester that won the Battle of Boston. Now, don't take what I say to mean that there was no death or there was no destruction, because just in that bombardment of that night when Washington set up all those defenses, there were several houses. Women's and children's screams and cries for help could be heard up on the heights where these American cannon men were firing from. And I mean, that's got to be gut-wrenching. So there was battle, there was blood, but it was nowhere near the scale or size that people expected it to be. That was coming in New York. But until New York happened, the siege of Boston had been a stunning success, and Washington's performance had been truly exceptional. He had bested General Howe and his regulars, despite insufficient arms, ammunition, shelter, sickness, inexperienced officers, lack of discipline, clothing, and money. I mean, that's ridiculous. His patience with Congress had been unbelievable, which for a general in that day is truly remarkable, that he had patience with politicians. And while he had been saved repeatedly by his own council of war from his headlong determination to attack, and it would have resulted certainly in a catastrophe, he had accepted the judgment of the council with no ill temper or self-serving histrionics. I mean, it truly is, that's a rarity in this day and age, especially for a general. And Washington couldn't have been happier to be over with the siege of Boston, but he also wanted to get to the next battle. But Washington was correct in his sense that great political change was coming. Remember, up to this point, independence hadn't really been discussed, but he wrote to Joseph Reed, his friend that he wrote letters to at his Cambridge headquarters. He attributed this good sense of change for independence mainly to the pamphlet Common Sense, which, if you've never heard of that before, you either didn't pay attention in high school or you didn't go to high school in America, because every single one of us learned about that. Thomas Paine was the author, and Washington wrote to Reed and said about this pamphlet, "My countrymen, I know, from their form of government and steady attachment heretofore to royalty, will come reluctantly into the idea of independency. But time and persecution brings many wonderful things to pass, and by private letters which I have lately received from Virginia, I find common sense is working a powerful change there in the minds of many men." The entire embodiment of Washington's logic for this war was a direct quote from what Thomas Paine had written. Quote, "The sun never shined on a cause of greater worth. Everything that is right or reasonable pleads for separation." And they separated themselves from Boston on their way to New York. An army that had not moved at all for nearly a year was on the march, leaving New England for the first time. To most of the men, the prospect of being on the move was extremely welcome. Spirits were higher than they had ever been, and many decided that the soldier's life had a little bit to be said for it after all. Most in the ranks had no idea where they were going, but were just glad to be going. One of the soldiers, John Lapham of Duxbury, he wrote to his, quote, "honored parents to send a pair of shoes as quickly as possible, for I expect that I shall march off soon, but whither we shall go I do not know, nor can I tell." One by one, the regiments made their way to New York. And never have truer words been spoken than when General Washington said on July 2nd, 1776, of the coming situation of this war that was nowhere near over. He said, quote, "The fate of unborn millions will now depend, under God, on the courage and conduct of this army." And although they had incredible success at Dorchester Heights, they were about to enter their first real test in New York City.